It was 1944, deep in the final grinding stretch of the Second World War, when a strange and unforgettable scene unfolded across several American prisoner-of-war camps. The morning sun had barely risen, the air still carrying the cold bite of a long night, when trucks rolled in carrying a fresh group of German POWs, soldiers who had marched across Europe with iron discipline, hardened beliefs, and an unshakable confidence in their own superiority. They stepped off the trucks expecting harsh treatment, expecting deprivation, expecting an enemy's bitterness. But what they found instead was something entirely different. Their boots hit the ground, and almost immediately they noticed the smell: warm bread, frying eggs, steaming coffee. It drifted from the camp cafeterias like a soft breeze, so different from the thin, watered-down rations they had grown used to on the collapsing front lines. At first, the Germans exchanged amused glances, smirks filled with disbelief. Could this truly be how Americans fed their prisoners? They whispered jokes among themselves, mocking the idea that the enemy would offer such comfort. They laughed quietly, shaking their heads at what they assumed was unnecessary softness or maybe even propaganda. But the laughter didn't last, because the moment the cafeteria doors opened and the Germans saw trays loaded with real food, fresh fruit, warm vegetables, thick slices of meat, dessert portions stacked neatly on metal trays, the smirk slowly faded. The jokes died out. For many of them, it had been months since they had eaten a full meal. And before long, the same men who had laughed found themselves humbled, grateful, and lining up once again, this time for seconds. In that simple act, something shifted, not in politics, not in strategy, but in humanity. They arrived in the late morning, when the sun had risen high enough to warm the dust on the road, but not enough to soften the tension in their shoulders. The trucks rattled to a stop, brakes hissing like weary beasts, the German POWs tired, defeated, still trying to hold on to whatever fragments of dignity the war had not yet stripped from them. Stood in the back of the vehicles, blinking against the bright American sky. To them, captivity was supposed to be grim, harsh, punishing. It was the image painted in every rumor they had heard on the front lines. Allied camps, they believed, were places where a defeated soldier would be reduced to nothing. A man would eat only enough to stay alive. A man would be reminded daily that he had lost. This idea had become part of their armor. So when the order came to dismount, they jumped off the truck beds with stiff backs and raised chins, fighting the tremble of hunger in their stomachs. Their boots hit the gravel, kicking up small clouds of dust that drifted through the cool air. They formed into rough lines, not because anyone demanded it, but because instinct and training commanded it. Even in defeat, even on foreign soil, discipline was the one thing they still had control over. Without it, they might have had nothing left at all. But as they stood there, waiting for instructions, something unexpected drifted to them, something that made several men lift their heads with curiosity and disbelief. A smell. Warm, rich, comforting. It floated like an invisible ribbon across the compound. The scent of real cooking, of fresh bread baked that very morning, of eggs sizzling in pans, of coffee, strong coffee, the kind they used to drink at home when the world still made sense, the kind they hadn't tasted in months, the kind that didn't exist anymore at the front, where even officers sometimes drank weak substitutes made from roasted barley or burnt wheat. The men exchanged glances, confusion, suspicion. A few smirked. Could this be real? Could the Americans truly be preparing such a meal and for them? One soldier, a tall man with sharp cheekbones hollowed by hunger, gave a scoff under his breath. Another quietly laughed and shook his head. A third muttered something sarcastic about American-ish theater, American theatrics. They assumed this must be staged for effect, a trick, a display put on to impress them. Or perhaps they were imagining it altogether. Hunger could do that. It could make a man think he smelled things that did not exist. Yet the smell grew stronger. An American sergeant approached, his boots crunching on the gravel. His posture was relaxed but firm, nothing like the raging caricatures of enemies the Germans had been told about. He pointed them toward the processing area and then toward the cafeteria buildings beyond. A simple set of wooden structures, nothing fancy, but clean, organized and undeniably real. Still, the Germans sneered among themselves. Cafeterias, one whispered, almost laughing, for prisoners. Too generous, another muttered. They must be soft. But behind those words hid a quiet desperation. They were thin, underfed, living on what little their collapsing army could still spare. Their uniforms were worn, some torn at the cuffs, many caked with the dried mud of battlefields long behind them. Their stomachs growled beneath their coats, every step a reminder of their deprivation. And so the laughter that came from them wasn't truly laughter. It was brittle, hollow, held together by pride instead of joy. A shield, a last defense against the humiliation they feared was coming. As they continued moving toward the processing line, they caught clearer glimpses inside the cafeteria through open windows, shiny metal counters, rows of trays, American cooks in white aprons, large pots of steaming food. The sight pulled their eyes like magnets, though they tried hard not to show it. They looked away quickly, noses up, pretending indifference. This was not the POW life they had been told to expect. In Europe, German propaganda painted the Americans as decadent, undisciplined, lazy. Soldiers were taught that Americans relied on machines for everything, that they were soft, unprepared for hardship, incapable of survival without luxury. So when the Germans saw the cafeteria's neat arrangement, the orderly lines, the polished ladles, and stacked plates, their immediate instinct was to mock it. One POW leaned toward his friend and whispered a joke about American hotels, and several others snickered. A few shook their heads in disbelief, murmuring that this was proof of the Americans' weakness. "They treat prisoners like guests," one said. Ridiculous. And yet, beneath those mocking words, a different emotion stirred, one they weren't ready to acknowledge. Envy, the kind a starving man feels when he smells bread. Their laughter was an attempt to smother that feeling before it took root. Because if they admitted envy, they would also be admitting something far more painful, that the world they had believed in, the ideals drilled into them for years, were beginning to crumble. Their boots carried them forward through the gates, past the watchtowers, and deeper into the American camp. They walked through tidy pathways lined with gravel and bordered by wooden fences. Some saw the organized barracks, the small vegetable gardens tended by earlier POW groups, the water pumps and laundry stations. It was nothing lavish, just functional, practical human. Too humane, some thought. More laughter surfaced, but this time it came forced, weaker, as though their own voices betrayed them. The cafeteria smell grew stronger still, wrapping around them, invading their defenses. The hunger gnawed harder now, crueler, because the promise of real food waited nearby. A few POWs clenched their jaws, trying to ignore it. Others looked away, eyes hard but empty, and still others, though they hid it well, felt the sting of tears threatening behind tired eyes. Because hunger is more than a physical ache. It is memory. It is longing. It is loss. For some of these men, the smell of freshly baked bread was a ghost of the lives they once had. Breakfast with family, warm kitchens, quiet mornings before the world collapsed into fire. An American soldier motioned for the group to continue moving. "You'll eat soon enough," he said, not unkindly. The Germans bristled at the implication that they needed kindness from their captors. Their pride flared, and a few smirked again, this time in defiance. But pride, when starved long enough, becomes fragile. They were led toward the cafeteria building, and the closer they got, the more their faces changed. Some men began swallowing hard, as though preparing to hide their hunger once inside. Others exchanged looks that said everything their mouths refused to admit. Finally, they stopped outside the entrance. The Americans opened the doors, and inside the POWs saw everything clearly: the food, the trays, the organized system of serving. They even saw other German prisoners already seated, eating quietly, some with expressions of disbelief still plastered on their faces. That sight alone cracked something in them. Because this wasn't propaganda, this wasn't a farce aid, this wasn't a trick, this was real. One POW muttered, "Unfassbar, unbelievable." Another whispered, "Das ist nicht möglich." This cannot be possible. And yet it was. Still, they clung to the last scraps of mockery they had left. A chuckle here, a raised eyebrow there, a sarcastic comment about American indulgence. It began with something so small, so deceptively simple, that none of the German POWs could have predicted the effect it would have on them. A plate, a tray, a spoonful of hot food placed in front of a man who had spent months learning to survive on rations unfit for a soldier, let alone a human being. No speeches were given, no explanations were offered. The Americans simply handed them their meals one by one, as though feeding prisoners well was the most natural thing in the world. At first, the Germans accepted the trays stiffly, postures locked, jaws clenched, still determined to maintain the facade of pride they had built on the walk toward the cafeteria. But the moment they looked down at what had been placed before them, something shifted. Something deep and silent and unspoken. There were vegetables, real ones, not the gray, flavorless scraps they had become accustomed to. There was meat, thick slices, warm and rich with steam still rising. There was bread, soft enough to leave a thumbprint if pressed. And there, resting in a small compartment of the tray, was something almost unthinkably indulgent dessert. A sweet portion, a treat, something that felt impossibly out of place in a prisoner's meal. Some of the men stared at their trays as though expecting them to vanish like a mirage. Others lifted them cautiously, unable to reconcile what they were seeing with everything they had believed about enemy camps. A few looked around in suspicion, as if someone might leap out and shout that the food was a trick. One prisoner tapped the edge of his tray, expecting it to be tin, brittle and rattling like the battered mess kits the army had issued them. Instead, the tray was thick, solid metal, not fancy but sturdy, built for use and meant to last. Another prisoner touched the bread with 2 fingers, watching the soft indentation remain. It felt unreal, like a memory from the past. No one took the first bite immediately. There was fear in that hesitation, not fear of the food, but fear of what it meant. Fear that accepting kindness from an enemy was somehow a surrender greater than laying down their weapons. Fear that their hunger made them weak. Fear that the stories they had been told for years were beginning to crumble. Finally, a man near the end of the serving line lifted his fork. He brought a small bite of potatoes to his lips, chewed, swallowed, and froze. His eyes widened. He took another bite, bigger this time. Then another. The change in his expression traveled along the line like a whisper. A moment later, others followed. Small bites at first, testing, confirming. Then the tempo shifted. Forks moved faster, eyes lowered to plates. Shoulders dropped. The tension that had clung to them like iron began to loosen. The cafeteria grew quiet. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of men remembering what it felt like to eat a real meal. Some kept their heads down, ashamed that they couldn't hide their hunger. Others sat upright, eating with almost ceremonial slowness, as though savoring every moment. A few shook their heads softly, bewildered. One soldier closed his eyes while chewing, the taste unlocking a flood of memories he had not allowed himself to feel for months. Home, family, a warm table, a world before the war hollowed him out. The American cooks moved behind the counter, watching discreetly. They didn't make a show of their compassion. They didn't take pride in being generous. They simply fed the prisoners because it was the right thing to do. Because it was what soldiers did for those who had surrendered. Because humanity, in spite of everything, was still humanity. The Germans didn't know how to process that. Many of them had fought on fronts where prisoners were treated as burdens or threats, not human beings. They had seen camps where survival depended on luck more than mercy. And here they were, sitting in rows at metal tables, eating a meal that rivaled what many civilians back home could no longer afford. Confusion settled over them thicker than the steam rising from their plates, a confusion that gnawed deeper than hunger ever had. One older POW, whose face had collapsed into sharp angles from months of malnutrition, sat staring at his tray long after he finished eating. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from disbelief. He whispered something to himself, a sentence that no one else heard, but that echoed in the air nonetheless. Warum tun sie das? Why are they doing this? No one answered him. No one could. Pride had been their armor when they entered the camp, but pride cannot compete with the warmth of a full stomach. Pride cannot compete with the taste of nourishment after starvation. Pride cannot compete with a simple truth. The enemy they had been taught to despise, the enemy they were told was savage and brutal, was feeding them better than their own command ever had. Some of the younger POWs wrestled visibly with this realization. They shifted in their seats, looking around nervously, as though waiting for an officer to tell them how to feel. But their officers were men just like them now, tired, hungry, defeated, and they too were eating with the same quiet astonishment. One officer, a man who had kept a stern face through every checkpoint and interrogation, finally broke. He lowered his fork, leaned forward, and whispered to the soldier beside him, This is more than my family ate last month." His voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the weight of admitting a truth he had hidden even from himself. Another soldier wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, embarrassed by how quickly he was eating. He looked around to see if anyone noticed, then realized everyone else was doing the same. They were men stripped of pretense, eating not like soldiers or prisoners, but like human beings who had been starving for far too long. The cafeteria lights cast a soft golden glow over them. It made their hollow cheeks look fuller. It made their sunken eyes seem brighter. It made them look, if only for a few minutes, less like prisoners of war and more like weary travelers, finally resting at a warm inn. There were no political speeches made, no propaganda banners, no triumphant music. Just the quiet hum of cutlery on metal trays and the soft shuffle of boots beneath the tables. The turning point was not a dramatic moment. It was not a declaration or a gesture. It was the slow, gentle realization that kindness could exist in a place where they expected cruelty, that humanity could appear where they anticipated bitterness, that a warm meal could break through the hardened walls that months of suffering had built around their hearts. One soldier glanced up at the American flag hanging near the door. He looked at it not with anger but with confusion. A man trying to reconcile the enemy he had pictured with the people who now fed him. The flag did not look threatening. It looked strange, complicated, a symbol of a world he had never understood. Another POW caught the eye of one of the American cooks. The cook only nodded, not with triumph or superiority, but with a simple, quiet acknowledgement. "Eat. It's all right." And for the first time since capture, the German lowered his guard. Just a little. Across the room, a soldier who had tried so hard to mock the cafeteria earlier now stared into his plate, shoulders sinking as if he finally allowed himself to feel the truth. His pride softened, his anger loosened, his hunger, so vast, so constant, was at last quieted. A single tear slipped down his cheek. He wiped it quickly, hoping no one noticed. But others did and understood. The war had taken so much from all of them that a small act of dignity felt overwhelming. Some prisoners finished their meals slowly, savoring each bite, unwilling to let the moment end. Others paused mid-meal to simply breathe, their stomachs full for the first time in months. The air changed, not dramatically, but subtly. A heaviness lifted. A kind of stunned peace settled over them like a blanket. Even the faint sounds outside, the distant boots, the wind through the fence, the muted calls of the guards, felt gentler now. Not because the camp had changed, but because the men inside it had. The food had not transformed their circumstances, but it had transformed something inside them. Something wounded, something fractured. For the first time, they felt human again, and that was the turning point, not the food itself, but the realization that the hands feeding them belonged to men who saw them not as monsters, not as trophies of war, but as fellow human beings caught in the same brutal tide of history. It was a silent lesson none of them would ever forget. By the second day, the atmosphere in the camp had shifted entirely. The laughter that had greeted the cafeterias on the first morning was gone. In its place was a quiet, almost hesitant anticipation. The German POWs moved differently now, not with the rigid, defensive posture of soldiers expecting hostility, but with a slower, more measured gait, as if each step toward the cafeteria was a negotiation with themselves. They lined up earlier than required, some shifting nervously from foot to foot, hands clasped tightly in front of them, eyes flicking toward the serving line to see what awaited. The air smelled of warm bread, fried eggs, and freshly brewed coffee, drifting across the compound like an invisible invitation. This time, the men did not scoff. They did not whisper sarcastic comments. They did not mock the Americans. Instead, they waited, tense and unsure, as though to admit they were hungry enough to want more would be to confess weakness. And yet, in their silence, there was something else, a tentative curiosity, a fragile acknowledgement that the world could still surprise them with small acts of kindness. When the doors opened and the first POWs stepped forward, it was almost ceremonial. They held their trays with care, watching the lines of soldiers ahead of them, noting the slight pauses, the hesitant glances exchanged between friends and comrades. Each man was aware of the other's presence, aware of the subtle dance of pride and humility unfolding before them. Some had already eaten, but the smell, the warmth, the sight of the food compelled them to join the line again. Seconds were no longer a luxury. They were a necessity, not of survival alone, but of reclaiming a fragment of dignity lost in months of deprivation. Each step toward the serving counter was a quiet act of surrender, not to an enemy's power, but to the undeniable truth of their own needs. It was as if the camp itself had transformed the same walls, the same fences, the same guards, yet everything inside felt different, almost alive with a new, subdued rhythm of humanity. The Americans behind the counters observed the scene with quiet efficiency, offering trays filled with generous portions without a word. They had long understood that feeding prisoners well was not a gift, but a duty, and the reactions of the Germans, though expected to be wary at first, now unfolded like a slow, absorbing story. Each man in the line shifted uncomfortably under the weight of his own conscience and pride. Some lowered their eyes, afraid that gratitude might show too clearly on their faces. Others glanced sideways at their comrades, gouging whether they, too, felt the same strange emotions, the mix of relief, shame, and awe that could accompany a kindness received from one considered an enemy. And there, in the quiet clatter of trays and utensils, a subtle bond began to form, not of soldiers aligned by ideology or conquest, but of human beings recognizing, in the smallest of gestures, the humanity of one another. When they reached the serving line, each soldier took his tray with careful deliberation. Some hesitated, unsure if they deserved such attention. Others glanced back at the growing line behind them and realized that no one questioned their right to take more. The POWs began to understand in that slow, almost painful way that only hunger and exhaustion can teach, that asking for seconds was not a mark of weakness, but an acknowledgement of survival, resilience, and trust. The line moved steadily, the men silent but deeply aware of the strange intimacy this simple act created. Eating had always been a communal experience, but here it was a communion of shared history, of recognition, of humility. The soldiers were no longer rivals. They were participants in a shared moment of humanity that transcended the uniform and rank stitched into their sleeves. As each man returned to his table, tray in hand, the change became more apparent. Eyes that had been hard and wary now softened. Shoulders that had been tense began to slump in relief. Conversations remained minimal, but they no longer needed to be filled with jokes or sarcastic remarks. The presence of food, the act of receiving it, had stripped away layers of pride and fear, leaving behind a raw, honest acknowledgement of basic human need. Even the officers, who had tried to maintain a strict sense of order and authority, allowed themselves to relax. They had entered this process expecting to command obedience, but instead they had been quietly commanded by the simplest, oldest law of survival: feed the body, and the soul will follow. The line for seconds stretched and ebbed, a silent river of movement that carried men toward nourishment and back to the tables, each step a tiny act of submission and self-acceptance. Some POWs cast furtive glances at the cooks, unsure how to interpret the absence of malice, the presence of genuine care. Others looked at their own fellow prisoners and saw reflected in their eyes the same astonishment and reluctant gratitude. It was a powerful, unspoken lesson that small gestures could pierce the defenses erected by months of war, fear, and propaganda. Pride and ideology had their place, but hunger and compassion had theirs too, and in that balance, the men were learning more about the enemy and themselves than any battle could ever teach. A few moments of hesitation were punctuated by quiet acknowledgments, a nod, a brief smile, a murmured "danke" that slipped past lips unpracticed in gratitude. The act of taking seconds became almost ritualistic, a deliberate participation in a world that seemed impossibly orderly, kind, and patient. The POWs who had once laughed at the cafeterias now understood that the lines were not merely for food. They were for restoration, for reconciling the human experience with the harsh realities they had endured. Each bite reaffirmed a simple truth, that to nourish a body was to heal a fragment of the spirit, and that mercy, when administered without expectation, had the power to alter perceptions as profoundly as any weapon could on the battlefield. Some men lingered longer than necessary, letting the warmth of the food and the quiet rhythm of the cafeteria sink in. Others returned quickly for a second portion, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence, as if daring to accept that generosity without ridicule was possible. The shift in the camp was subtle, nearly invisible to anyone outside observing only with the eyes of routine discipline, but it was seismic to those participating. Walls of suspicion and ingrained hostility were not demolished instantly, but they were chipped away, plate by plate, second by second. In those lines for seconds, the POWs began to feel a bond not with their captors, not with ideology, but with the unspoken understanding that humanity could exist even amidst war, and that dignity could be preserved in unexpected ways. By mid-morning, the cafeteria had become a quiet stage where these transformations played out in slow motion. The POWs moved with a measured rhythm, trays clinking softly, eyes lowered in quiet contemplation, shoulders relaxed enough to reveal the fragility beneath the surface toughness. Some of the men paused mid-step, studying the steam rising from the trays, savoring the aroma as if it were an elixir of life itself. Others glanced at their companions, seeing reflected in each face a mirror of their own astonishment and gratitude. There was no laughter, no sarcasm, no mockery, only the sober, reverent acknowledgement that the simplest acts of care could render pride irrelevant, and that mercy could quiet the loudest fears. The second servings, small and tangible, had become symbols of something far larger, the possibility of recognition, the power of trust, and the unexpected strength of kindness. At the end of the line, some men paused to watch others receive their portions, realizing that the act of taking seconds had become communal, a silent celebration of endurance and survival. Each tray handed out was a testament to a principle they had long thought impossible, that respect and compassion could exist between foes, and that acknowledgement of need could foster understanding where hatred had once reigned. The Americans behind the counters watched, quiet but perceptive, understanding the gravity of their work, that feeding these men was not merely sustenance but a subtle, profound lesson in human decency. And the POWs, eyes wide with incredulity, shoulders slackened with relief, slowly began to grasp it. They were being fed not to break them, but to restore them, not to humiliate them, but to honor them. And so, the lines for second helpings continued to flow. Soldiers once hardened by ideology and hunger moved forward again and again, carrying their trays, accepting the generosity, and in so doing, absorbing a lesson that would linger long after the food was gone. The act was simple, almost mundane to an outsider, but it carried the weight of revelation. Each step forward was a step toward humility, each bite a quiet acknowledgement of shared humanity. The experience did not erase months of war, nor did it erase the memories of battles fought or the losses endured, but it created a moment of clarity, that kindness could penetrate even the thickest armor of pride, and that the simplest gesture, a second helping of food, could transform fear, doubt, and scorn into gratitude, reflection, and an almost imperceptible peace. By the time the lines shortened and the trays thinned, the POWs returned to their tables changed, at least subtly. Shoulders were more relaxed, eyes less suspicious, movements less rigid. The act of taking seconds had reshaped the space around them. The cafeteria was no longer just a place of feeding, but a crucible in which they learned, quietly and irrevocably, that acts of compassion had power beyond words or bullets. In the stillness that followed, as the last trays clattered softly onto tables and the last bites were swallowed with reverent care, the transformation was clear. For the first time in months, the POs felt nourished, not merely in body but in spirit, and that nourishment, though intangible, was far more profound than any ration could have been alone.